Hello everyone, I am a postdoctoral fellow at the School of History and Culture. I often read Khenpo Sodargye's Bodhicharyavatara and the Pure Land teachings of Tibetan Buddhism. It's a great honor to have this opportunity to consult Khenpo Sodargye in person. I have a question, which is, currently, Pure Land Buddhism is widely spread in both Han and Tibetan regions. However, in the Han region, the main Pure Land scriptures are generally referred to as the 5 sutras and 1 treatise, or the 3 sutras and 1 treatise. So, in the Tibetan Pure Land tradition, which main scriptures does it rely on? I'm not sure if there are any, and if there are the Pure Land scriptures in Tibetan region complete? My second question is, since the goal of Pure Land Buddhism is rebirth in the Pure Land, but the conditions for rebirth are explained differently by many Dharma teachers. Some teachers say you have to recite until your mind is unwavering, that you must recite until you reach the state of single-mindedness without confusion or attain a pure mind, while other teachers say, there are no conditions for rebirth. Amitabha Buddha saves all beings equally. As long as you continuously recite his name, you can be reborn in the Pure Land. So, regarding the conditions for rebirth and the meaning of single-mindedness without confusion, I would like to ask Khenpo to give us some guidance on this. That's my second question. My third question. A great master once said, reciting the Amitabha heart mantra 7 times is equivalent to chanting Amitabha's name 1,000 times. Is there any scriptural basis for saying that reciting the heart mantra 7 times is equivalent to chanting the name 1,000 times? Because in the 5 sutras and 1 treatise of the Han tradition, they all emphasize the name itself. There is no mention that this mantra is even more supreme than the name. I would also like to ask Khenpo to clarify this point. Thank you.
These are very good questions. As for the first question, in our Tibetan region, in fact, the foundation of the Pure Land school still relies on the Pure Land Sutras. Now, regarding the Pure Land Sutras, in the Han tradition, there are the 5 sutras and 1 treatise. Actually, the 5 sutras and 1 treatise are the Amitabha Sutra and the Infinite Life Sutra, as well as the Contemplation Sutra on the Buddha of Infinite Life, the chapter on the perfect penetration of mindfulness of the Buddha by great strength Bodhisattva, and the chapter on the practices and vows of Samantabhadra. These are the 5 sutras. The 1 treatise is the treatise on rebirth. In Tibetan region, there is no concept of 5 sutras and 1 treatise. In fact, the 5 sutras and 1 treatise is a way of categorizing used by certain great masters in the Han tradition. I have great confidence in the 5 sutras and 1 treatise. Among them, I want in this lifetime to create this karmic connection. Human life is truly hard to come by, to be honest. To create this connection, I plan to give teachings on all of the 5 sutras and 1 treatise. Right now, I have already finished teaching the Amitabha Sutra, the Infinite Life Sutra, and the Contemplation Sutra. I have also finished teaching the chapter on the perfect penetration of mindfulness of the Buddha by great strength Bodhisattva. There is still the Samantabhadra's aspiration to noble deeds left. If I don't pass away, I definitely want to complete it in the future. And there's also the treatise on rebirth. The treatise on rebirth is very short, and there is a commentary on it by Master Tanluan. These 2 should be possible to complete. But in our Tibetan region, although we don't refer to the 5 sutras and 1 treatise, in fact, the Infinite Life Sutra and the Amitabha Sutra, these 2 are included in our Tripitaka collection. The Contemplation Sutra is not included. I think if I have the time, even though my translation may not be very good no matter what, I still want to create some merit or favorable conditions for my own future rebirth in the Pure Land. So I am planning to translate the Contemplation Sutra. That's my intention. Many great masters in Tibetan region mainly rely on the Infinite Life Sutra and the Amitabha Sutra. Later on, this includes masters like Jetsongkhapa and Mifam Rinpoche. The various masters of the Sakya school and the Kagyu school each have their own specific practice rituals. There are a great many key instructions on both the rituals and the theoretical aspects of practice. This includes many teachings found in the Terma texts as well. So, in terms of the basis and methods for attaining rebirth, there is actually not much difference between Tibetan Buddhism and Han Buddhism. That answers the first question. The second question is about rebirth in the Pure Land. In Tibetan region as well, there are many different views among the various masters. You could say opinions are quite diverse. When I was teaching the Contemplation Sutra, especially in the later sections, I talked about the 9 levels of rebirth in the Pure Land. The 9 levels of rebirth each have their own unique causes and conditions in this context. Later on, especially when I discuss the lowest of the 9 levels at the end of the Contemplation Sutra, I personally felt a sense of confidence about it, and I shared this with many people. I also shared it with many Tibetans, and I really wanted to translate it. If the later sections are translated, the requirements are actually not very high. if any of us sincerely recite the Buddha's name, we should have this opportunity. Of course, in Tibetan region, we also have our own explanations. To be reborn in the pure land of ultimate bliss, one must possess 4 causes. These are visualizing Amitabha Buddha and the pure land, accumulating merit, purifying negative karma, generating bodhicitta, and finally making aspirations and dedicating the merit. There is also the teaching that 4 conditions are needed to be reborn in the pure land of ultimate bliss, and the teaching of single-minded concentration without distraction. Only a few great masters have spoken about this idea. To truly reach the state described by Master Yin Guang, the state of single-minded concentration without distraction, is actually quite difficult for ordinary people like us. But in my own view, if we follow what is described in the latter part of the Contemplation Sutra, even those who have committed the 5 gravest offenses, that is, even those who committed the 5 heinous crimes, can still be reborn in the Pure Land. So if we sincerely recite the Buddha's name and make earnest aspirations, many of us can succeed. In Han tradition, reciting the Buddha's name has 2 meanings. This is important to note. Here, recite means recollection or mindful remembrance. The character for recollection also refers to the present mind and is closely related to the mind. Today, many people, when talking about reciting the Buddha's name, only do so verbally, thinking that chanting Amitabha Buddha out loud is what it means to recite the Buddha's name. But for many people, visualizing the Buddha is actually the most crucial part. In the practice of reciting the Buddha's name, I have seen in many Han scriptures and commentaries, one should not only recite with the mouth, but also remember with the mind. If you do so, after eliminating your negative karma and obstacles, you will definitely be able to attain rebirth in the Pure Land. Now, the third question concerns the words of this great master. Actually, you should be asking him this question. Maybe you can't find him otherwise, since it was his statement, not mine. He said that if reciting the heart mantra 7 times can substitute for chanting the Buddha's name 1,000 times, then he should be the one to answer this. But in my personal opinion, I have never seen any basis for this. Although there are many teachings about the merits of reciting Amitabha Buddha's name, or about how much merit there is in reciting mantras, these have been discussed a lot, but I have never seen anything saying that the merit of reciting mantras is greater. I have not come across this aspect. But just because I haven't seen it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, so it's best if you can find him.
I am a student at the Center for Religious Studies. I'm a first-year graduate student. I have 2 questions I'd like to ask. One question is, as you just mentioned, that the conclusions reached through academic research and through spiritual practice are not the same. So I'd like to ask you, is it possible to combine academic research and spiritual practice well? That's my first question. My second question is, well, the second one is rather basic. I once read a very famous book called The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. I've gone through that book several times, but I just can't get into it. I'd like to get some guidance from you, or hear your thoughts on that book. I wanted to ask for your advice. Thank you.
Academic research and actual spiritual practice can indeed be combined. In Tibetan region, we call this hearing, contemplation, and practice. Hearing means first listening and learning. Contemplation is then reflecting on its meaning, and practice means putting what you've understood fully into action in your daily life. This is called practice, also known as habituation. Actually, in academic study, I believe both hearing and contemplation are necessary. Because if you haven't really thought deeply about something, it probably won't work. So one aspect is listening and learning, reading many treatises and studying. Hearing and contemplation are essential. But as for later practice, many people lack that. For example, many mind training methods in Tibetan Vajrayana Buddhism, including the rarity of human life and the impermanence of life. When we talk about the impermanence of life, many people think it's very simple, nothing worth practicing. Even those who have studied for many years feel there's nothing to it. But when you actually go to practice it for real, wow, moment by moment, it truly is impermanent. The result of contemplating it deeply in your own mind is very different from just talking about it or writing about it in a book. They're not the same. So what we call this is the simultaneous practice of listening, contemplation, and meditation. You could put it that way. As an academic pursuit, some historical aspects might not require much practice. Just knowing about them is enough. But in Vajrayana, whether it's faith, wisdom, or certain principles, as Master Tsongkhapa said, there is something called renunciation, bodhicitta, and non-dual wisdom. These are the most fundamental aspects of learning Buddhism. If you want to fully understand these three, it may only be possible after a long period of practice. So I feel that for some Buddhist teachings, if you genuinely and deeply awaken to them in your heart, it's impossible to do so without actual practice. As for the second thing you mentioned, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, if you really can't get into it, I really can't figure out the reason for that. And honestly, I can't think of any way to help you get into it. Maybe drinking coffee, or just kidding. Actually, this book has been very well received by many people, both in China and abroad, and has been greatly appreciated by audiences. So what is it like? Actually, I've also read the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. I read the Chinese version of this book. After reading it, what did I feel? Well, basically, it's about the Bardo teachings. In Tibetan region, we have Guru Padmasambhava's special Bardo teachings. He just added some things to the Bardo teachings, including his conversations with his root guru and stories about some Westerner getting cancer. He weaves in things that Westerners nowadays like to hear, and adds in some principles that modern people care about and are interested in. That's how this book was written, more or less. So after reading it, if you look a bit deeper, it should really be the Bardo instructions of Guru Padmasambhava. As everyone knows, the Bardo instructions are extremely popular in the West. Why is that? For many Westerners, when they end up feeling physically unwell or emotionally troubled, especially when facing death, many people experience fear. As a result, the Bardo teachings have become very well received by many people. At that time, Sogyal Rinpoche took some aspects of the Bardo teachings and combined them with the mindset of modern people to create this work. I think the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, it has two main features. The first is that he holds tremendous respect for his own guru, his teacher. That's my impression after reading it, because he repeatedly says that all the knowledge he gained in this life is entirely due to the kindness of his teacher. I feel this is the most touching aspect of the book. From beginning to end, he is always expressing gratitude to his teacher. That's one thing. The second is that he is able to connect current life with the original teachings of Buddhism and present them together to those who are destined to encounter them. So if you're not facing any particular difficulties, I suggest you keep reading. You might be able to get into it.
Hello, Master. I am a postdoctoral researcher at the School of Education, Shaanxi Normal University. To be honest, when it comes to Buddhism, I'm an outsider and don't really understand it. I'd like to take this opportunity to ask a question. From the perspective of Tibetan Buddhism, what do you think are the main problems in our country's current education system? Where do these main issues manifest, and how should they be addressed? Thank you.
This is how I see it. From the perspective of Tibetan Buddhist thought, I don't actually have many opinions about education itself, but if we look at it from the standpoint of Buddhist philosophy, I do think that there are indeed issues with today's education. Just as some professors at Peking University have pointed out, there are some notable and significant issues and challenges at present, especially if we do not pay enough attention to our traditional culture. There have also been some incidents recently, and now in our society, such things keep happening one after another. So when it comes to our education, in the past it was about having both moral character and talent. Morality should come first, then ability. But now all the focus is on scores and on external appearances. So the core of education is about cultivating people. As a teacher training institution, the most important thing should be how a person conducts themselves in society in the future, how to serve society, how to be filial to one's parents. These are the basic principles. But now many educational philosophies, including the way some teachers teach. I have also learned a lot about this myself. Sometimes even teachers themselves lack the basic principles of being a decent person. But all of these, I think, now require us to prepare for some necessary reforms. This reform may not be possible in other areas, but we should put moral education first. Only then does education have hope. This is also what we Buddhists believe. I think people from other religions and the older generation, those who understand traditional culture, would agree with this as well. Otherwise, many people end up learning some Western ideas, and among Western ideas, there are both good and bad ones. So I'm still quite concerned about education, but sometimes I feel helpless.
All right, thank you.
I am a third-year graduate student at the Religious Studies Center, majoring in Religious Studies Theory. This year, when I attended a conference in Lanzhou, scholars at the meeting said that in today's world, the spread of religion shows a trend. Christianity is moving eastward, and Tibetan Buddhism is spreading westward. That is to say, Catholicism and Christianity are spreading to Eastern countries, while Tibetan Buddhism is spreading to Western countries. I would like to ask Khenpo a question, which is, what is the situation of the spread of Tibetan Buddhism in Arab countries?
It should be said that the spread of Tibetan Buddhism in Western countries now, this happened during the 20th century. Just like Dr. Toynbee once remarked, when people look back on the 20th century, the most meaningful and the most interesting thing, and even its importance, what surpasses the atomic bomb and hydrogen bomb? It is the gradual spread of Buddhism to Western countries. These are his exact words. Judging from his statements, it is indeed true that Tibetan Buddhism is respected in the West. Originally, the West was a region where Christianity was very prosperous. But because of certain aspects of Tibetan Buddhism, as I just mentioned, its methods for adjusting the mind are extremely effective. I often think whether it's teachers or students, no matter how great your reputation or wealth may be, in the end you still can't escape birth, aging, sickness and death. In the past, I've seen that many scientists and political figures, when ultimately facing life and death, all of them are in great need. In such circumstances, Tibetan Buddhism truly is a particularly profound form of Dharma. As for what you just asked about the Arab countries, up to now, as far as I know, it may not have been widely spread yet. In the former Soviet Union, Mongolia, including Singapore, Malaysia and Australia, in these places, Tibetan Buddhism nowadays can be found in various universities and colleges. Some time ago, I looked into the major universities in the United States, mainly including Yale University, Columbia University and Harvard University. I did a rough count and found that there are 17 different universities which currently have research centers dedicated to Tibetan Buddhism. In our own institute, there is a postdoctoral fellow from an American university who has become a monk. I asked them, and they said they had no idea at all. Basically, in all the schools they had attended, there were research institutions of various levels, including both smaller organizations and larger, well-established academic centers. So for them, Tibetan studies are considered extremely important. But in the Arab world, perhaps there are only a few centers, or maybe some Rinpoches are there amidst the wars, but I don't know what the situation is like.
Hello, I am a master's student at the Center for Religious Studies. Many Dharma protectors in Tibetan Buddhism are recorded in great detail and classified in some academic works. Their records and classifications are very detailed. But when searching the original texts, there are very few accounts of them. Regarding their origins, sources, and so on, may I ask where their usual records are kept? Thank you.
As for Dharma protectors, actually in some Buddhist histories in Han region, there are also a few Dharma protectors. Just like the stories of Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva and others, in Tibetan Buddhism, especially in the Dharma texts, there are particularly many such accounts. When Guru Padmasambhava came to Tibetan region at that time, he encountered many obstacles from Tibetan demons and evil spirits. Then Guru Rinpoche subdued them one by one, and after subduing them, they made vows before Guru Rinpoche to uphold and spread the Dharma and not to cause harm. But as I mentioned earlier, this may only be valid on the basis of faith. If you have faith, it is indeed true that the Dharma protectors in Tibetan region are especially rare and extraordinary. Looking at Tibetan history, for example, when Desi Sangye Gyatso passed away, by following the instructions of the Dharma protectors, he kept his passing a secret for 15 years. The secret was maintained until the recognition of the sixth one. If you really look at these stories, they are extremely rare and remarkable. Then, from my own personal experiences, when we used to visit Bhutan, like when we went to Bhutan, there was a Dharma protector there called Zima. The Zima Dharma protector is able to descend and possess someone. When the protector descends, the person originally doesn't understand any Tibetan at all, but after being possessed by the Dharma protector, he communicates in very fluent Tibetan. This is extremely, extremely rare. I was right there at the time when the master was giving an empowerment and the Dharma protector descended. I myself also had many special sensations in my body, and as for these sensations, if you tell someone who doesn't have faith, they might think I'm lying and may not accept it. But whether they accept it or not, the fact remains as it is. In Tibetan region, including the Vajra dance, many of these have different origins and backgrounds. All of these are recorded in the historical text dedicated to Dharma protectors. However, there are very few of these that have actually been translated into Chinese.
Master, hello. I am currently in my third year of my master's program. I would like to ask you a question regarding Buddhist doctrine. We know that after Mahayana Buddhism developed in India, although there were later differences between the Madhyamaka and Yogacara schools, there was a tendency for them to merge in the later period. And this led to the formation of the Madhyamaka Yogacara school, something like that. But later, when it was transmitted to Tibetan region, figures like Tsongkhapa, as far as I understand with my limited knowledge, mainly stood from the perspective of Madhyamaka. Later, if we look at modern times, I remember Master Fazen from the mainland. He also stood from the Madhyamaka standpoint. He even tended to critique and refute Yogacara thought. In recent years, I've noticed that foreign scholars studying Madhyamaka also seem to be influenced by this tendency. I'd like to ask, my first question is, according to your understanding, what is the overall view of Yogacara thought in Tibetan Buddhism up to the present day? What is the perspective on Yogacara thought? The second question is about you personally. What is your attitude toward the relationship between Madhyamaka and Yogacara? How do you view the relationship between the two?
Actually, Tibetan Buddhism is not dissatisfied with Yogacara, nor does it refute Yogacara. That's not the case. Logically speaking, at the time of Tang Xuanzang, when he was in India, he studied under many Yogacara masters. In the Han region, the Yogacara school has always been highly valued. On the surface, it seems that Tibetan Buddhism places more emphasis on Madhyamaka, while Han Buddhism values Yogacara greatly. So is there any contradiction between the two? Actually, that's not the case. In our Tibetan region, even including masters like Tsongkhapa and Master Fazun, in some of their treatises, they do offer some refutations of the Yogacara school. But these refutations are not directed at the true doctrines of the school itself. They are only aimed at certain views within the Yogacara according to reasoning and Yogacara according to scripture. When they examine the ultimate truth, they acknowledge the existence of something unempty, what we call illuminating mind, the real existence of the illuminating mind. Of course, the real existence of the illuminating mind, according to the third turning of the Dharma wheel, that is the original face of Tathagatagarbha, this point is acceptable. However, the Yogacara school does not state this in terms of provisional appearances. Even in the ultimate sense, there is such an illuminating mind. But when examined through the Madhyamaka perspective, it cannot be established. So when refuting it on the level of appearances, this is a refutation within the ultimate truth. As for the conventional level, in fact, Tsongkhapa and everyone else acknowledge that all phenomena are mind only, just as is explained in the Dashabhumika Sutra and the Vijñaptimatrata Siddhi. The principle that all phenomena are created by mind is accepted. On this point, including myself, if I combine this with your second question just now, I personally believe that there is no conflict or contradiction between Yogacara and Madhyamaka. Moreover, this non-contradictory unified perspective is something I actually translated a few years ago, Mipham Rinpoche's commentary on the adornment of the middle way. The commentary on the adornment of the middle way is actually a work that aims to establish both Madhyamaka and Yogacara views. Within Mahayana Buddhism, the concepts of Yogacara and Madhyamaka are indispensable. In the commentary on the adornment of the middle way, these points are explained in great detail and with remarkable clarity. So I especially hope that many people, even though the commentary on the adornment of the middle way is a particularly subtle and difficult to understand work of reasoning, it is only after studying it that one realizes from what perspective Madhyamaka establishes its own views, and from what standpoint Yogacara begins to establish its own views. The differences and similarities between the two then become immediately clear.
Hello, Rinpoche. I am a Tibetan student from Qinghai. I am a second-year doctoral student at our Center for Religious Studies. What I want to ask is, in my hometown, Tongda County, Hainan Prefecture, Qinghai Province, in this county town, there is a story that everyone, young and old, knows. At that time, the Shaanxi Palace in Tongda County was called Shaanxi Temple in Chinese. The abbot of this monastery is named Tsawang Rinzeng. This abbot attained realization at that time. This happened in 1958. In 1958, he was about to be publicly denounced. They tied him up on horseback. On the way to the denunciation, he attained the rainbow body and flew off to a pure land. As for this kind of event, we really don't know exactly what happened. I'd like to hear your opinion.
In 1958, such things did indeed happen in Tibetan areas. He was called Khenpo Sodargye. He belonged to the Dzogchen tradition and traveled there to rely on his respected teacher. Later, during the time of the denunciations, at that time, the Khenpo was living in a cave or in a secluded place. They demanded a large mass meeting and insisted on publicly denouncing him right there. They made him ride on a cow or a horse, and on the way to the meeting he had already flown away. Many people who witnessed this found it quite extraordinary and remarkable. But I myself used to have doubts about this incident as well. Even Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro had doubts about whether it was actually true or not. Later on, Khenpo Tsultrim Lodro, he is a great Khenpo in our institute, maybe you know him. Once, when I traveled to either the United States or Singapore on my way back home, I bought him a watch. After a while, the watch was gone. I asked him, "Where did you leave it?" He said, "I used it as travel expenses, hired a car, and went all the way to Qinghai." He went there specifically and with great purpose to investigate and learn more about the story of Lama Tsawang Rinzeng, wanting to understand all the details surrounding it. The watch was called Seiko. At that particular time, it was widely considered to be a very good brand abroad, which was called Seiko. Back then, the Khenpo personally went to the local area to find out the truth. In fact, several witnesses from that time are still alive today. Some people didn't dare to speak or accept interviews from the Khenpo. Some people are still willing to talk now, because they no longer hold any government positions. Some of them have already officially retired. The whole situation truly did happen just this way. This Khenpo even wrote a dedicated article about it. I hope that after you carefully read this article, you will realize that this is a true story. Later, we also learned more about it from various sources, and it is indeed true that at that time he was a rainbow body practitioner, because the witnesses at the time, when the strong wind appeared, the Khenpo was chanting mantras while flying higher and higher in the air. Later, these people were extremely shocked, and when they came back down, none of them dared to talk about it. They just said that he died on the road, and after he died, they buried him there and returned. Then they started bragging there was nothing else they could do, it was all like this. But now, a few of the people involved are still alive. One by one, he went to the local area, first interviewing people everywhere. Later, he also recorded videos and audio, and everything was confirmed. This is extremely rare in the eyes of the average person. It's the same as the story I just told about Jinjian Bhikkhuni. We also have many in Tibetan region. For example, in Buddhist history, there was a person named Animanmo. She and her retinue also flew to the Pure Land. People nowadays might not believe what they're told, but there's nothing you can do even if you don't believe it. Such phenomena do indeed occur.
Hello, Khenpo. I work at our school's publishing house. I am reading The Practices of a Bodhisattva. There were some problems in the middle. I don't understand it very clearly. I hope you can explain the precious human rebirth I have.
In fact, a precious human rebirth. It means to distance oneself from the 8 non-leisure states and attain the 10 endowments, for example, the non-leisure states, hell, hungry ghosts, animals, long-lived heavens, borderlands, etc. There are 8 kinds of non-leisure states which refer to the lack of time for spiritual practice. Extremely, extremely busy, just like people nowadays. Every day we get busier year after year, but the busier we are, the less we actually accomplish. So many people don't practice at all. Even many practitioners nowadays say, "I'm too busy, I can't practice the Dharma." This is called lack of leisure, meaning there is no free time. As for endowments, it refers to the 5 endowments of oneself and the 5 endowments of others. These are all explained very clearly in the words of my perfect teacher.
Hello, Khenpo. I am a third-year graduate student at the Center for Religious Studies. I am not sure if there is any such concept like rely on the Dharma, not the person in Tibetan Buddhism, or rather classical evidence. What's your opinion? This is the first question. The second question is, isn't the Vajrasattva practice spreading from your side now? In my humble opinion, I think that is to say, isn't it true that most practices are systematic in nature? For example, there are preliminary practices and a whole set of subsequent practices, and they are based on various scriptures. When the Vajrasattva practice is introduced, due to its systematic nature, for example, we should carefully read certain scriptures that specifically correspond to this practice. What are the required preliminaries for it?
Generally, we in the Buddhist scriptures, sometimes it is said to rely on the Dharma, not on the person, when discussing the 4 reliances. Sometimes it is said to rely on a qualified teacher. On the surface, it seems that a qualified teacher is also a person. So does that mean we shouldn't rely on them? Actually, that's not what it means. According to our Tibetan sources, I have previously translated Sword of Wisdom for Thoroughly Ascertaining Reality by Mifam Rinpoche. In this text, the 4 reliances are explained quite clearly. In fact, relying on the Dharma rather than the person means that in our process of practice, we must rely on the content of the Dharma itself. For example, when cultivating renunciation or bodhicitta, the teachings themselves are very important. If a person has a good reputation and is very wealthy, nowadays many people are what we call fans or idol chasers. When someone becomes famous, everyone follows them around. But other things they say actually in accordance with the Dharma. If we don't examine this at all, then such a person is not someone we should rely on. So how should we rely on the Dharma? When relying on the Dharma, we must depend on a qualified spiritual teacher or guru who possesses the characteristics of the Dharma. This is something we must rely on. If you do not rely on this, then no matter how wise the Dharma may be, just as it is stated in the Avatamsaka Sutra, without the guidance of a good spiritual friend, it is impossible for you to truly master it. Therefore, for such teachings, it is essential to rely on a guru. But in this case, is there any fault of relying on the person rather than the Dharma? There is not, because with this kind of teaching, without relying on a guru, you cannot unveil its mysteries. Therefore, you must rely on a qualified spiritual friend. Now, some people say that in Tibetan region, when one is taking refuge, it is common to also take refuge in the guru, but in Han regions, it is enough to just take refuge in the three jewels. Some people hold this view, but I think it is unreasonable. For one thing, there is also the 4 refuges in Han regions. During the Tang dynasty, there was a yoga practice ritual. It says in there, take refuge in the teacher, take refuge in the Buddha, take refuge in the Dharma, take refuge in the Sangha. All 4 refuges are already mentioned. Moreover, in the Han regions, people especially like to take refuge and get a refuge certificate. In our Tibetan regions, generally we don't issue refuge certificates. Being a disciple of the 3 jewels is enough. There's no need for a certificate. But in the Han regions, there are still quite a lot of people who get refuge certificates. But it is possible to take refuge. If it's the embodiment of the 3 jewels, representing the 3 jewels, that's also acceptable. However, when you take refuge, you need to understand this. Buddhism is like a university in our world. Generally, the content of university education is very important. The content of the education is equivalent to the Dharma. But who do we rely on to guide us through this education? We should rely on teachers for guidance. If you don't rely on teachers, no matter how good or high quality the educational content or material is, you might not necessarily be able to benefit from it in the way you expect. So, the relationship between these 2 aspects should be understood in this particular way. That might be a bit better. This is your very first question. The second question that you have raised is about the practice of Vajrasattva. Actually, regardless of which tantric practice it is, there are 2 types of Vajrasattva practice, a simplified version and a more complex detailed version. If you use a simplified practice, as I just mentioned earlier, in the Tang esoteric tradition, you visualize a solitary Vajrasattva. You sincerely recite the confession yourself, then visualize light merging into you, purifying all your negative karma and obstacles. This doesn't require a lot of empowerments or many preliminary practices. If you purify yourself in this way, that's okay. In Han Buddhism as well, especially in Tang esoteric Buddhism, there are many practices that rely on mantras, including the Shurangama mantra, reciting mantras, and visualizing the Buddha. Such practices also exist in the exoteric tradition. However, if you want to visualize on a deeper level, as described in Words of My Perfect Teacher, you must have the foundations of the preciousness of human life, taking refuge and generating bodhicitta. That is why in Tibetan Buddhism, every ritual begins with taking refuge and generating bodhicitta, then reciting the ritual and finally dedicating the merit. This is the reason for it as well. As for your foundation, only disciples who take refuge in the 3 jewels and have faith in Buddhism are qualified. And such a person must also generate the aspiration for the benefit of all sentient beings. Only on this basis can you practice this ritual. This is also the reason why every ritual begins with taking refuge and generating bodhicitta.
First of all, I have great respect for Tibetan Buddhism. It is a sacred religion. So here, I would like to raise a question, which is, one is the Kalachakra philosophy, that is, the Kalachakra Tantra. When and from where was it transmitted to Tibetan region? How did it develop in Tibetan region? Please give a brief overview of this. Thank you.
Actually, Kalachakra is in the year before Shakyamuni Buddha entered Parinirvana. Generally, in our Tibetan calendar, it's the 15th day of the 3rd month. At that time, he went to a place in southern India called Dhanakataka. Back in 1990, I visited there and saw it myself. Originally, there was a particularly large stupa here, and Shakyamuni Buddha was there. He taught the Kalachakra Tantra to his destined disciples there. So this Kalachakra Tantra is a tantric teaching spoken directly by the Buddha himself. Some people say that the Buddha never taught tantric teachings. Actually, such claims are very unreasonable. The Kalachakra Tantra was spoken directly by the Buddha. Even now, the Indian government continues to protect this place. What is this place called? It's called Dhanakataka. Dhanakataka is in the south of India. Later, in order to protect this place, Bodhisattva Nagarjuna built a stone wall around it. Later, because India suffered destruction at the hands of Islam, when Buddhism was being destroyed, those stone walls basically no longer exist today. But later, during the later propagation period, some translators translated the essential teachings of the Kalachakra Tantra into Tibetan. Now the Gelug, Nyingma and Jonang schools, several schools have the complete Kalachakra practice. They have the Kalachakra empowerment as well as all of its tantras. My guru, the precious one, once went to Mount Wutai. I think it was in 1987. In 1986, there were probably several thousand people who participated in a Kalachakra empowerment. The Kalachakra empowerment is something people are especially eager to receive. Moreover, these Kalachakra teachings integrate the inner channels, winds and drops of a person with the external physical world. They are explained in a complete and thorough manner. This is a tantra that discusses the relationship between the human body and the external universe, including in our Nyingma tradition, the omniscient Mifam Rinpoche, who wrote a commentary of over 1,000 pages with millions of words. Even now, people are still studying it regularly. So, in our Tibetan region, the propagation of Kalachakra can be found in every monastery. There are its texts, practice liturgies, and so on. Even its symbols are hung at the entrance of every household. That's how it is. Some of the liturgies have been translated into Chinese, as well as some historical materials related to this. The Jonang tradition places particular emphasis on Kalachakra. This is how it is in our Tibetan Buddhism.
Hello, Lama. My question is also related to this. This is a question that has troubled me for a long time during my previous research. I hope the Dharma teacher can give some guidance on this issue. This is related to my previous inner journey, because I studied psychology for my master's degree before, and then did philosophy for my doctorate, so I look at many issues from this perspective. I used to really like Western philosophy, and at that time, Hegel's lesser logic from Germany served as my guiding light. I was very close to this kind of Western philosophical way of thinking. But later, when I entered the world revealed by Yogacara and Buddhist logic, Hetavidya, I felt that compared to before, with our Buddhism, I had a very strong sense of intimacy. I use the word intimacy. I really felt that closeness. Because of my previous academic background, I started to study this area. Mainly starting from Yogacara and Buddhist logic, I began to study them carefully. The Nyayadvarataka and the Nyayabindutaka, these two works. Nowadays, some scholars in China, especially in academic circles, stubbornly refuse to acknowledge that Bodhisattva Dignaga had this, and believe that his Buddhist logic only includes direct perception and inference, and they persistently refuse to recognize the function of scriptural authority, Shabda Pramana. They use purely logical, formal, logical reasoning methods to study it. There are many shortcomings, and I have also written articles about this. I have raised many questions regarding these aspects of their views. Some of these articles have already been published. Because from the Nyayadvarataka, I believe Dignaga's standpoint is very clear. If you study it carefully and try to understand it, scriptural authority, Shabda Pramana, definitely holds a very important position. Moreover, scriptural authority, direct perception, and inference should be consistent with each other. They should not be viewed separately. What I mean is, I would like to ask the teacher about this. What is your view on the relationship between direct perception, inference, and scriptural authority? What is your perspective on Dignaga Bodhisattva's logic?
Very good. On one hand, this is a higher education institution directly under the Ministry of Education. It does have its own unique characteristics. Secondly, many of the questions you raise in your research on Buddhism are all well thought out. Such questions are indeed extremely meaningful and valuable. I personally believe, in my view, that whether it's teachers or students, the questions being asked are all practical ones. I think the reasoning that the teacher just mentioned is very good. In fact, these are things that are worth reflecting on nowadays. Generally speaking, when we consider our logical reasoning process, includes ultimate logical reasoning and conventional logical reasoning. Ultimate logical reasoning is the method of analysis used by Bodhisattva Nagarjuna. This is similar to what you just mentioned about Hegel's method of argumentation and dialectics. In fact, there was a former Soviet named Shcherbatsky. He once said that the logical reasoning of Bodhisattva Nagarjuna is exactly the same as Hegel's logical reasoning. Later, I also enjoyed reading some books related to Hegel's philosophy. Actually, what he talked about was more on the level of phenomena and did not penetrate deeper like Bodhisattva Nagarjuna did, as described in the root stanzas of the Middle Way. This is my view. At a certain level, it should be said that regarding the true and profound mysteries of matter or consciousness, it cannot reach the ultimate depths of Nagarjuna's thought. As for the Buddhist logic in our Tibetan Buddhism, it can be said that this way of thinking is especially active in Tibetan region, and it is also very meaningful. Why is that? As everyone knows, the debates in Tibetan region, it's not for the sake of arguing or for me to win and you to lose. It's not like that. In fact, debate is used to purify the mind and to truly dispel certain doubts at their root. That's why studying Buddhist logic is especially important. I think that whether it's Han Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism now, many Buddhist organizations, if they had a foundation in Buddhist logic, perhaps many issues wouldn't feel so vague and unclear. It should be like this. At this point, some people might think that inference and direct perception are things we can use logical reasoning for, but they don't accept scriptural authority as valid. In fact, this view is indeed unreasonable. Why is that? Because actually, scriptural authority should be considered a part of inference. We can put it this way. It's a part of inference. So how do we get the other party to accept the authority of Scripture? We must study the second chapter of the commentary on valid cognition. Recently, I've been discussing the second chapter of the commentary on valid cognition with a few individuals, because it is very important, as we often say. Shakyamuni Buddha is a master of valid cognition, and what he says is correct. But if what he says is to be correct, how do we prove this? Shakyamuni Buddha is truly someone who does not speak falsely, someone who speaks the truth. This point has already been demonstrated in Dharmakirti's second chapter of the commentary on valid cognition. There are two ways. In the past, there was a famous Gelugpa master named Alakshadanda. He lived a long time ago and specifically wrote a treatise establishing Shakyamuni Buddha as a master of valid cognition. This treatise first establishes that Shakyamuni Buddha's Dharma is correct. Then, using this, Shakyamuni Buddha is established as a master of valid cognition. Or, just as explained in the second chapter of the commentary on valid cognition, Shakyamuni Buddha is established as a master of valid cognition, and thus everything he says is the truth. Therefore, in this context, for scriptural authority to become inferential cognition, it must be established through a process of reasoning and demonstration. Simply stating, for example, what is said in the Diamond Sutra, those who believe in Buddhism can accept this. But those who do not believe in Buddhism may not necessarily accept it. In this case, we should use the establishment of the Blessed One as a master of valid cognition before it can be established. Therefore, in such circumstances, the reasoning explained in the Pramana Samukaya can be established independently. We have one type of valid cognition, which is scriptural authority. However, this type of valid cognition can also be included within inferential cognition. This is the first point in our Pramana Vartika, which corresponds to the first two lines of the Pramana Samukaya. This can serve as the basis for establishing Shakyamuni Buddha as a master of valid cognition.
I am a professor at the University of Mannheim in Germany. I discovered Vajrayana Buddhism and found that Tibetan Buddhism is especially attractive in the West. In Germany, Tibetan Buddhism was particularly successful in the 1980s. I would like to ask because I feel that we Westerners' understanding of Buddhism, especially our understanding of Tibetan Buddhism, is quite superficial. Our understanding of Buddhism is very simplistic. We might be able to grasp some of the simple principles, but I think it's very difficult to have a deep understanding. So I want to ask, when Tibetan Buddhism is being spread in the West, should it adapt to Western culture and also adjust its original Tibetan cultural elements? Will this create a conflict? Or in the process of cultural adaptation, will Tibetan Buddhism itself also undergo some changes? Venerable, how should we understand this?
Indeed, Tibetan Buddhism nowadays is quite widespread, including in Han regions, as well as Western countries like Germany, the UK, and so on. These places find it somewhat attractive, but I think the main reason is that Tibetan Buddhism, our Tibetan Buddhism, relies on the teachings of the great masters of the past, which are very practical. It's not entirely theoretical, nor is it just about academic study or creating an image. Many of its practices, including current methods for cultivating bodhicitta and the direct pointing out instructions of Dzogchen in Vajrayana, which directly cut through your afflictions, are both simple and accessible. This is the kind of approach it offers. The other day, just recently, I saw that in Boston alone. There are more than 30 Tibetan centers in that area, all within a single city. For other forms of Buddhism there, it's still quite difficult. So regarding this issue, I think the main reason is, one is the pith instructions of the lineage, and the other is the simplicity of the rituals. In addition, Tibetan region has always placed great emphasis on genuine study. Nowadays, in many places, Buddhism has become just an image. But this kind of superficial image can never last for long. Many people ask me, what is Buddhism? Is prostrating Buddhism? Is worshipping the Buddha and burning incense Buddhism? I say that's just the outward image of Buddhism. The true teachings are about cultivating bodhicitta, practicing many principles. This is the real essence of the teachings. Buddhism is established in the mind, not in outward appearances. If I get a certificate of refuge, does that make me a Buddhist? Not necessarily. If I wear monastic robes and shave my head, is that enough? Not necessarily either. So I think that ordination has its own inner meaning and Buddhism has its own teachings. Therefore, the key lies in this. Even though Tibetan region has gone through historical changes and many ups and downs up to now, I truly believe, I'm not saying this just because over the years I've learned about Han Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism, and I've also come to understand quite a bit, at least on the surface, about many aspects during this process of learning. Why is it that so many people are drawn to it? They're not fools. Everyone is genuinely benefiting from it. This includes some college students. Nowadays, people are realists. If something truly benefits you, you're willing to learn it. If there's no benefit, just stories or folktales, nobody needs that, and no one is willing to accept it. So many people, through practices like the cultivation of bodhicitta that have come from Tibetan region, have indeed found that it plays a real role in their daily lives. This applies to anyone, whether in China or abroad. Everyone faces troubles and suffering. When it comes to reducing suffering, whether in this life or the next, it's like an effective medicine. Everyone is willing to accept it.